Welcome back, everybody. I think we should move on and continue with our last invited speaker for today, Marit Westergaard. I would like to introduce you Marit and her collaborators, Natalia Mitrofanova and Evelina Leivada from Arctic University of Norway. Unfortunately, Evelina cannot join us, but Marit and Natalia will present the talk together. Marit is the director of the Aurora Center Acquisition, Variation and Attrition in the Arctic University of Norway, and she's also leading a research group at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology at Trondheim. Her research interests include first, second, and third, and bilingual language acquisition, heritage languages, and language attrition, as well as comparative syntax, both modern and diachronic. She will present us the talk exploring bilingual effects on cognition through grammatical illusions. So Marit, when you are ready, please, you can start.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction. I'll share my screen with you.
Yes.
And it works.
Yep.
Okay, and then let's see.
Perfect.
You can see it now?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so first of all, I would like to say thank you for this invitation and opportunity to speak at this really interesting event. And since I am the last invited speaker, I would also like to thank the organizers for a really well-organized event and interesting talks. At the same time, I have to say that I'm really looking forward to the follow-up, which I really hope, keeping my fingers crossed, that it will take place physically in Moscow. Because even though Zoom is great, it's not like the real thing of meeting in person. So I really hope to see you all in person sometime in the summer or after the summer. But there is, of course, or there are some positive aspects of being able to do Zoom. I mean, we can all meet, even though we are in very different places in the world. So I am in Tromsø, which is above the Arctic Circle, which means that unlike Arturo, who could show us through his window yesterday that the sun was coming up, that's something I can't do, because above the Arctic Circle, there is no sun at this time of the year. In fact, the picture that you see here on the front page of my presentation, I took at 11 o'clock, exactly as today, exactly as this conference was starting. So this is about as light as it gets here at this time of year. But let's move on to the talk, and let's see if this works now. Doesn't want to move. That's very odd.
Maybe you have an option to click two arrows in the very bottom of the...
That is what I'm doing, and it's not moving. So, okay, I can do it this way. All right. So as Beatrice already mentioned, I work at the Aqua Aurora Center at the Arctic University of Norway. Aqua stands for Acquisition, Variation, and Attrition, and our sort of subtitle is The Dynamic Nature of Languages in the Mind, which means, of course, that we work on multilingualism across the lifespan. Here are some examples of what we work on. So the Aqua Aurora Center is divided into 4 themes. Theme 1 studies multilingual minds and the factors affecting multilingual outcomes. So similar to what Monica was talking about earlier today. Obviously, we also look at cross-linguistic influence, and that is the topic of theme 2. Then we also look at linguistic proximity and closely related varieties, which is, and Norway is a good place to look at that because there are so many different dialects and they have been studied extensively. And then we also consider neurocognitive adaptations as a result of multilingual experience. Now, this talk will be based on 3 articles that have come out of this research community. And they are the following. It's an article by Evelina, Natalia, and myself that has been submitted. In fact, it's under revision right now, called "Bilinguals Are Better Than Monolinguals in Detecting Manipulative Discourse." And then, as more of a background, 2 other articles. This one by Evelina and myself, published this year in Frontiers: Acceptable Ungrammatical Sentences, Unacceptable Grammatical Sentences, and the Role of the Cognitive Parser. And finally, a paper also published this year by Evelina and myself, together with Yonandoni Donabeitia and Jason Rothman, on the phantom-like appearance of bilingualism effects on cognition. How should we proceed, or should we proceed? This is published in BLC, and it's also open access. Now, all 3 articles are direct results of a project called DIVA, which stands for Disentangling Variation, a cross-linguistic investigation of bilingualism and non-standardization. Now, this is Evelina's Marie Curie project, which she carried out here at UIT for 2 years between 2017 and 2019. And before we start, I'll show you a picture of all the co-authors involved in these papers. First and foremost, there is Evelina, of course, and then there is Natalia, and she will present part of the talk today. Evelina is currently in Tarragona in Spain, and Natalia is here at UIT. Our co-authors also include, for the last paper, Yonandoni Donabeitia at Nebrija in Spain, and Jason Rothman, who's here at UIT, and then myself. Okay. So let's give you an overview of the talk. We will first of all examine how variation in cognitive development, for example, being monolingual versus bilingual, will affect linguistic cognition and specifically our ability to detect cognitive illusions. And now, right, okay. Then we will try to tap into the so-called bilingual advantage or bilingual effects through a novel task that features a special type of linguistic stimuli that trick the cognitive parser into acceptability. And through this experiment, try to explain the phantom-like appearance of the bilingual advantage. And by phantom-like, we mean sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't, as we know from considerable literature in recent years, and propose a novel hypothesis about its origin. Now, one prerequisite here is to try to understand how the human parser works. So the computational brain learns from experience the expected value range of certain variables. For example, the distance between two points, and continuously updates memory resources accordingly. Now, in this process, the brain has a tendency towards radical contextualization, which entails a propensity to, first of all, to adhere to Grice's maxims of cooperation, even when the communicative context lacks the conversational features that call for the application of these maxims, and also contextualize the incoming stimuli by drawing on those memory resources that are most readily accessible. Now, one thing that I wanted to say when I showed you the pictures, because it had already been mentioned by Beatrice, is that unfortunately, Evelina is not able to join us today. Now, that is very unfortunate because this is all her work. Even though one shouldn't start a talk by apologizing, I kind of have to in this case, because both Natalia and I will be presenting work that is mainly Evelina's, and there is a chance, a risk, that we won't be able to answer all your questions. But in that case, I hope that we can come back to you after we have consulted with Evelina. All right, back to the talk. So because our mind takes all this contextual sort of noise into account, we may be led to judgment errors. And there are certain problems that are typical where we see that we are led to these judgment errors. One of them is an old one presented by Kahneman and Tversky from 1981 called the Linda problem. And it goes like this. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now we're given two options. Option A, Linda is a bank teller. And option B, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. The question is, which one is more probable, option A or option B? Now, when you ask people this, the results show that many people perceive Linda as a very good fit for a feminist activist, and they chose option B. However, that's a little problematic because there is a logical relation between A and B. The set of feminist bank tellers is included in the set of bank tellers, which means that for B to be true, two things have to be true, whereas for A to be true, only one thing will have to be true. So for that reason, the likelihood of two things being true is less than the likelihood of one thing being true. The probability of B can't be higher than the probability of A. And now my system doesn't want to show what's on the slide. Oh well. Let me just read what's supposed to be on the slide further down. So this error judgment boils down to the human parser being this propensity to contextualize. And we are thrown off by this information about this irrelevant, in a sense, information about Linda, which we take to be relevant, but can't be. Here is another illusion, and I'm hoping you can see it. There it is. All right. So here's probably a more well-known illusion, the Mueller-Lyer illusion that many people know. Typically, we estimate the lower line to be longer than the one on top. But of course, that is due to the arrows pointing inward or outward. That tricks our parser to estimate the lower line as longer. And this is so strong that even when we measure the lines and we know that they are the same length, our parser still tells us that the lower one is longer. Now let's have a look at some cognitive illusions outside the visual domain. Now here's the candy illusion, also by Kahneman, but a later one, 2010. So a chocolate bar and a candy cost altogether €1.10. The chocolate bar costs €1 more than the candy. How much does the candy cost? Whoops, sorry, I should go back there. Oh. Right, there we are. How much does the candy cost? The intuitive answer is 10 cents. But that can't be right, because if the candy costs 10 cents, then the chocolate bar must cost €1.10. So then we're at 120. So the answer is 5 cents, but we're tricked into the intuitive answer. Another illusion is the Moses illusion. How many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? This is, as I said, the Moses illusion. About 50% of people who are asked this question answer 2, even though if they are also asked who took animals into the ark, they know that it's Noah and not Moses. So, how do we explain these cognitive illusions? Well, Kahneman himself says the parser is lazy and doesn't do the work required to suppress the intuitive answers. Other people have talked about a partial match strategy, which means that upon receiving a linguistic stimulus, its structures, terms, or concepts are matched to stored knowledge. And the parser aims for a sufficient match, not an absolute match. So it's kind of like a good enough strategy. And the parser seems to set a processing threshold, and the stimulus is then checked against previous knowledge up to this threshold, and that's when we get this partial matching. Now, an important question is, do we all set this threshold at the same level? That is, does variation in cognitive development play a role here? Now, what people have found, for example, Wellwood et al., is that neurotypical speakers of English spot the comparative illusion to varying degrees. In fact, Kahneman himself, when he presented the candy illusion, found that students at Harvard and MIT were much better than students at other universities. I don't know exactly what that means, but at least it means that there is variation. And this variation is also found, is then found, this means that variation is found among people that speak the same language and fit the same behavioral profile. So our hypothesis is that people with pronounced differences in cognitive aptitude, and cognitive aptitude is here defined as the combined outcome of mental abilities, such as speed of computation, attention orienting, or task switching efficiency. These people will perform differently in tasks that involve demanding processing over tricky patterns of superficial well-formedness. Now, superficial well-formedness. Now we move into the area of grammatical illusions. Superficial well-formedness is a special type of ungrammatical sentences that trick the cognitive parser into assuming that it is acceptable. But before we go there, we have to define acceptability versus grammaticality. Now, if we do a search in PubMed for the terms acceptability judgment tasks and language, or grammaticality judgment tasks and language, we get results showing that the studies are based on the exact same elicitation technique. But we are asking the question, isn't there a distinction to be drawn between grammaticality and acceptability? Let's see how that could be done. So here we have a sentence which is clearly ungrammatical. What did Mary eat pasta and? And it's also unacceptable. Now, the next sentence, dogs, dogs, dog, dog, dogs, is in fact a grammatical sentence. It seems crazy to claim that, but if you consider that dog can be both a noun and a verb, and as a noun, and as a verb, it means something like to follow or to pester, then, and you replace dog here by, say, follow, then it becomes a grammatical sentence, something like dogs that dogs follow, follow dogs. So this is actually a grammatical sentence, but anybody, any speaker of English that you ask would say that it is an unacceptable sentence. And then, of course, we have sentences that are both grammatical and acceptable, like 5 here, she does linguistics. But is there something missing here? Are there sentences that are ungrammatical, but still acceptable, at least acceptable to some people? So if we look at this table, we have 4 cells here. We have sentences that are unacceptable and grammatical, like the dog sentence. Then we have acceptable sentences that are also grammatical, like the linguist sentence. Then we have ungrammatical sentences. And then the question is, do we have anything that we can fill into the final cell? Sentences that are ungrammatical, but acceptable. And the answer is yes. That's our answer, at least. And these are sentences like, more people have been to Russia than I have. Okay, this is a grammatical illusion. This grammatical illusion that we see in sentence 6 instantiates a type of linguistic illusion called a comparative illusion. We claim that it is acceptable because native speakers of English typically give it a rating of 4 to 5.5 on a 7-point Likert scale. And now, my system doesn't want to show you the rest of the slide. Let's see if it works if I go here. I'm very sorry, there's something that's not quite right with this.
We see it now. We see it.
Oh, now you see it. Right. Okay. Now it's there. All right. So it's acceptable because many people accept it, but it's ill-formed because the main clause subject calls for a comparison of cardinalities of sets, but in the absence of a bare plural in the embedded clause subject, no comparison set is made available. So let's move to the next slide here. So analyzing these grammatical illusions is something that Evelina and I did in this Frontiers paper that I mentioned earlier, called Unacceptable Ungrammatical Sentences. Sorry, Acceptable Ungrammatical Sentences. That's this type. Unacceptable grammatical sentences and the role of the cognitive parser. And we are going to use these sentences in the current experiment, in the current study. So in the current study, we use these grammatical illusions as stimuli that involve a dissociation of grammaticality and acceptability that tricks the parser. And we do this in order to tap into one of the most debated topics in current psycholinguistic research, namely the topic that we discussed in the third paper that I mentioned earlier, namely the bilingual advantage or bilingual effects. As we all know, and as I said earlier, some studies, or many studies, find such an effect, and many studies don't. But what is this bilingual advantage? Well, exposure, the claim is that exposure to more than one language can have a profound impact on cognition, and that bilingualism confers cognitive benefits that can range from delaying the onset of symptoms in some neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer, for example. But it may also have effects that translate into enhanced performance in tasks that tap into stimuli, inhibition, and working memory. So your typical executive function task. However, there is a crucial gap in the literature about where this bilingual advantage is. So the presence of the bilingual advantage has been found to leave a mark at both the behavioral and the anatomical level, but we don't know where exactly this advantage stems from. And we also don't know its exact target. And by target, we mean who benefits from it. Is it all bilinguals or just some bilinguals? And if so, which type of bilingual will benefit from this effect or advantage, if we like? As we all know, this effect has been shown to be phantom-like, and that is why we called our third article that is relevant for this talk on the phantom-like appearance of bilingualism effects on neurocognition. How should we proceed, or even should we proceed? Should we just leave it now and say, okay, we can't find out more, probably there is no effect, and let's move on to other things. Now, the answer to that question that we provide in this article is that we should proceed, and we have some suggestions for how that could be, how that should be done. Now, why is this effect phantom-like? Well, bilingualism has been argued to confirm a cognitive advantage that leaves a mark at both the behavioral and the anatomical level, but the behavioral effect is disputed for the following reasons. Now, let me see if there seems to be some delay in my system here. Sometimes I just have to wait.
Maybe you should try restart the presentation. That's the sharing screen or something. Maybe.
Did you have a suggestion? It now did show, right? You can see it now.
Yeah.
So for all executive function tasks, there are mixed reports showing that bilinguals do not always outperform monolinguals, shown by Costa and Donabatia et al. And others. Furthermore, the most recent meta-analyses also find an effect size of the advantage that is indistinguishable from zero. For example, Lehtonen and Donnelly et al. So the bilingual advantage in executive function seems to amount to a phenomenon that, and this is a quote by Pop, amounts to a phenomenon that either does not exist at all or occurs under undetermined conditions and lacks the frequency and size of a genuine phenomenon. Now, we think that perhaps the problem is that the tested domain is always executive functions. So what all these studies, both the ones that find a bilingual advantage and the ones that don't, what they have in common is that they test the bilingual cognition through executive function tasks. But when doing that, and this is a quote from Treccani and Mulatti from 2015, when we do that, we take for granted that there is a relationship between one, the processes exercised when bilinguals handle two languages, and the processes that underlie other cognitive functions, without, however, having a solid theory about why this relationship should be there. So the bilingual advantage hypothesis has always been predicated on the assumption that bilingual language control recruits general executive control. But recent results have questioned the idea of domain general inhibitory control as a unitary construct. So, for example, in a paper from 2018, Reimermet et al. Provide compelling evidence that the inhibition measures from 11 established tasks correlate only weakly among each other, indicating that there is no general effect. And this result casts some doubts on the claim that the experience of bilinguals in inhibiting one of their languages should consistently lead to a wholesale transfer that entails enhanced performance across all executive function tasks. So here is our novel approach to the bilingual effects on cognition. So, observing that the occurrence of the bilingual advantage in executive function is not ubiquitous, it's wise, we think, to reconsider whether this is the best domain to search for this advantage. So why should the experience of bilinguals in inhibiting or switching language translate in faster reaction times in executive function tasks that measure conflict resolution and the ability to ignore salient, distracted cues? Different developmental trajectories lead to different behavioral outcomes, but those differences need not necessarily transfer to all non-linguistic behavior or even some. So our novel approach to the bilingual advantage will include the grammatical illusions. So our prediction is that people with different degrees of cognitive aptitude, for example, monolinguals versus bilinguals, set the processing threshold that I mentioned earlier at different levels. And this will affect, one, their ability to check and suppress intuitive answers, and two, the fallibility to linguistic illusions. Now, this means searching for the bilingual advantage within the domain of language processing, not executive function. And as far as we know, this has not been tested before. So now we'll go to the present experiment, and Natalia will take over. I will still have to, I think, be in control of the presentation, but hopefully Natalia can unmute herself and take over.
Yes, thank you very much, Marit. I have already done that. So the empirical evidence that we would like to present to you today comes from a timed acceptability judgment task that we ran online. We collected two measures on this task. First of all, our offline measure was acceptability judgment, and we asked the participant to judge sentences on a 3-point Likert scale. And secondly, we also collected online measures, such as participants' reaction times to these sentences. Two groups of participants were tested. First of all, 138 adult neurotypical monolingual speakers of Greek, and they were compared to an equal number of adult neurotypical bilingual speakers of Greek, who also spoke a second language that was always a Germanic language. The groups were matched by age, gender, education, and handedness. Excluding criteria were non-native knowledge of Greek, reception of speech pathology treatment, inappropriate behavior on ungrammatical fillers, automatic responses, and for the bilingual group, we also excluded everybody who spent less than 4 years outside of Greece. So they should have had substantial experience with the second language. Can you go to the next slide, please? The experiment included two conditions. In the test condition, we asked the participants to judge comparative illusions of the type described by Marit before, sentences like, more people have been to London than I have, that from the first parse seem to be acceptable and grammatical. We used repeatable and non-repeatable predicates with quantifiers more and fewer. And the participants were also asked to judge fillers, which were grammatical and ungrammatical sentences, and there were twice as many fillers as test items. The sentences were presented one at a time, and the participants were asked to judge them either as wrong, neither correct nor wrong, or correct. In the warm-up session, they were asked to place the fingers on the three keys, 1, 2, and 3, corresponding to their judgments. 1 for wrong, 3 for correct, and 2 for neither, when they were not sure. So this was done to kind of make the task more similar to a lexical decision task and reduce noise in reaction times. So we didn't want them to move their hand too much, so that they just used the 3 fingers. As can be seen from this first figure, the amount of neither responses was marginal for both groups. At the same time, so the bilinguals were slightly more likely to press wrong, to judge the sentence as wrong than the monolinguals. And conversely, the monolinguals were more likely to judge the sentence as correct than the bilinguals. But now, so this is for all sentences, fillers and illusions calculated together. If we now go to the two conditions, fillers and on the left-hand side and illusions on the right-hand side, we can see that the accuracy on fillers was very high for both groups, and the groups performed almost identical, so very much alike. At the same time, there seems to be a difference in participants' judgments on the comparative illusions, with bilinguals scoring higher than the monolinguals, providing more accurate responses. Now, when we run the statistical analysis, this was indeed confirmed. So there were no significant differences between the groups on the fillers, but the groups differed in the test condition on the illusions. So bilinguals were significantly better than the monolinguals in judging the illusion as wrong. We also found the main effect of condition, so both groups were significantly less accurate on illusions than on fillers. All right, so turning now to the online results on the next slide. So overall, we also observed that there was a difference in reaction times between the groups. when the participants judged the sentence as either correct or wrong, bilinguals were significantly slower. So it took them longer to give their judgment than the monolinguals. So the next slide shows the analysis by condition. What we can see that the bilinguals were slower not only on the illusions, but across the board. It in general took them longer to respond to the sentence. So on both on feelers, they were significantly slower than the monolinguals. Now to the next slide. Another interesting result that we found in this experiment is connected to the kind of length of bilingual experience. So when we did a median split in the bilingual group, so the median age of residents outside of Greece was 7 years. So participants who spent less than 7 years outside of Greece were grouped together in the so-called short bilingual experience group, and participants who spent 7 years or more were grouped in kind of a long bilingual experience group. And so this result originally surprised us a little bit. So we can see that the accuracy on the fillers was comparable, so there were no significant differences between the groups. However, on the illusion condition, we can see that the monolinguals were performed the worst, and the group with shorter bilingual experience performed the best. However, the group with kind of longer bilingual experience was significantly more accurate than the monolinguals. At the same time, they were less and significantly less accurate than the group with shorter bilingual experience. Right, so if we now go to the reaction times, we see kind of a similar stepwise increase in reaction times from the monolinguals, who are the fastest, to people with short bilingual experience, and long bilingual experience group is in the middle. We find significant differences between monolinguals and both groups of bilinguals. However, only a numerical trend between the two bilingual groups. So the group with longer bilingual experience is faster, but not significantly faster than the group with shorter bilingual experience. Now, how can we account for these results? We think that the results provide evidence for a trade-off. We see that the bilinguals are better in spotting comparative illusions. That seems to be our first result. However, they are also slower across the board. And secondly, our results show bilingual effects in the linguistic domain, and we connect them to kind of enhanced linguistic control. So we think that bilingual experience makes them more aware and increases their error monitorability. Next slide, please. So, and based on these results, we propose plurilingual adaptive trade-off hypothesis that is based on the well-known adaptive control hypothesis by Green and Abutalebi, that states that bilinguals' interactional contexts entail an adaptive alteration on their language control abilities. What we add to this hypothesis is that we would like to argue that bilingual experience may result in enhanced error monitoring that decreases fallibility to grammatical illusions by means of recruiting sharpened top-down control processes. So bilingual experience increases their linguistic control and error monitoring ability. At the same time, the hypothesis also adds the crucial notion of speed-accuracy trade-off. So we see that the bilinguals experience a boost in accuracy, but they are also slowed down. So they become slower in reaction times. Next slide, please. How can we explain this enhanced error monitoring? It has been proposed before that reaction times are sensitive to the number of alternative interpretations that must be computed. And we can use time as a window to processing and maybe hypothesize that longer reaction times indicate higher setting of the processing threshold, one that involves checking and rejecting intuitive answers. And in addition, we also think that our study provides evidence for a plastic, adaptable trade-off, which, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So specifically, our results also show that this bilingual effect that we observe is modulated by the length of experience. Recall that we found that bilingual with longer bilingual experience performed worse than bilinguals with shorter bilingual experience in detecting the illusions. However, they were they also became slightly faster. So this kind of initial increase in error monitoring ability and subsequent decrease in error monitoring ability is kind of reminiscent of the neuroplastic trajectory that we heard about yesterday in, for example, Barbara's talk or Frederick's talk. So longer bilingual exposure may result in increased automaticity and consequently decreased error monitoring ability. So in essence, advanced bilinguals become more monolingual-like in their processing strategies over time. And interestingly, our results indicate that that kind of bilingual experience translates into the processing in their native language as well. So they become more aware and have higher error monitoring ability in their native language when they are just kind of novices in the L2, but then with increased automaticity, they get back to the kind of, or they kind of reduce their control. That goes back in a sense. They become, again, more monolingual-like. So yeah, I think that was the result of this acceptability judgment task. And I think back to Marit now.
Right, so I will just have a few more slides to wrap this up and go back to the article that I showed you earlier about the phantom-like appearance of bilingualism effects. Because the question is, what is the driving force of bilingual trade-offs? Well, what we argue in this article is that, and we are of course not the first ones to say this, but that several factors may play a role. First of all, the heterogeneity of the term bilingual. For example, I mean, we all know that there are many, many types of bilinguals: simultaneous, sequential, active, passive, balanced, unbalanced, and so on. And very often, many different types of bilinguals have been lumped together in the bilingual group in many of the previous studies testing executive function in bilinguals. So we think that a simultaneous bilingual with balanced exposure to two languages has a very different experience from a sequential bilingual with limited L2 exposure, perhaps only in some registers. So this is a factor that really needs to be controlled. And as I said, many people have also said this before us. Other factors that clearly play a role are, for example, the age of testing, the degree and type of switching, and the proximity of the languages involved. So if we go to the age of testing, we can say that the advantage is expected to be seen at its clearest when executive control and general cognition are at their weakest. So in children or in old age, as other people have pointed out. The type of switching that bilinguals typically perform is also extremely important. Obligatory stimulus-driven language switches in a bilingual's performance require frequent engagement of top-down control mechanisms, but not all bilinguals engage in this activity. The properties of the languages involved and the language combinations may also play a role. So if the languages are closely related, this may lead to fewer opportunities for code switching, so you will find less of an effect. Alternatively, we could find the other effect. It's possible that with closely related varieties, you require more resources for inhibition because the two languages are so similar. So these are questions that we actually don't know the answer to yet. But proximity of the languages involved is a factor that we think needs to be tested and controlled. Let's see. Now, we also think that all the driving factors offer a probabilistic perspective into the occurrence of bilingual effects on cognition, not a deterministic one. So different occurrences of bilingual modulations could be the outcome of distinct interaction effects, not just one factor by itself, but the interaction of several factors, rather than boil down to the same set or same subset of factors. So in a multi-causal situation, the operation of complex multivariate patterns is the norm, and factors of influence often push in opposite directions. Now, this is not to say that these factors can't be universally or reliably related to bilingual effects on cognition, but it means that one has to be really, really careful and look at them in combination. And in our article, we created a roadmap to the bilingual effects, and it looks like this. A study testing the bilingual advantage or bilingual effects should first of all have adequate power, that's on top here. Many studies have not had enough statistical power to be able to really say something about the difference between monolinguals and bilinguals. Secondly, they should have a uniform target group, as I already mentioned, not lump different types of bilinguals together, but control for the different types of bilingualism. Thirdly, it needs to have an adequate control group. So sometimes the monolinguals are also lumped together, and maybe they're not all completely monolingual, maybe they are bidialectal or whatever. So that's another factor that really needs to be controlled. The fourth factor is a number of confounding variables, for example, age of testing or socioeconomic factors that are known to play a role in these studies. Then we should control for or tap into the density of stimulus-driven code switching that is done in the bilingual group. move on to determine language proximity, as I also mentioned earlier, and finally evaluate the sociolinguistic prestige of these of the two languages, since that may be a proxy for language use. So the take-home message, this is the last slide. The take-home message from this talk is that acceptability judgment tasks, as the evidential basis of linguistics, can offer valuable insights both for linguistics proper, but also for interdisciplinary investigations. We hope to have provided novel evidence for the bilingual trade-off in a domain that has not been tested before from this perspective. We have proposed a hypothesis that we call PATH, the Plurilingual Adaptive Trade-off Hypothesis, as a hypothesis that moves away from unitary concepts with positive or negative values, but stresses the trade-off of bilingualism. And as always, more systematic testing is needed, as we point out in our figure, expanding both on the grammatical front, so testing different types of grammatical illusions, and of course also on the experimental front, using different techniques than acceptability judgments and reaction times, which is what we used, but there are many other techniques that of course can be used in this field. So with that, I just say thank you, and if you have questions, you can try to ask them. I hope that we can answer at least some of them.
Thank you very much, Marit, for such a great talk. We have indeed some questions and comments in the chat. I will read for you. We have quite a number. Let me see. First of all, we have comment that I saw about the very beginning of the talk about the illusories and the illusions and let me see. Here. Lorraine Obler. No, let me see here. I can see some people might judge, more people often have been to Russia than I have. So about the very beginning of your talk, acceptable as a sentence, acceptable, but has anyone asked them what it means? I wouldn't judge it acceptable myself, but I also couldn't tell you its meaning. I would guess it doesn't tell that I have not been to Russia, but there's more meaning there that does not get represented if I only respond to the question about what the sentence means by saying, it means I have not been to Russia. So it's just a commentary, but maybe you want to reply to Lorraine.
Okay, so Evelina did ask them, those people who accepted the sentences, what does this sentence mean? And they typically came up with two meanings. One was meaning A here, more people than just me have been to Russia. And meaning B is people have been to Russia more times than me. But then when, and some of them actually insisted that that is what the sentence means. So what Evelina then did was to add, let's see, she added some material. So here is a, so more people, let's see, how would that work? More people than, so there are more people have been to Russia than I have been to Russia. So when you add the material that seems to be elided here, then finally they see that it's ungrammatical. But Evelina clearly had to argue with some of them before they agreed that the sentence was ungrammatical and didn't have a meaning or didn't make sense. Now this was done in Greek, of course, so I don't know what the sentence would look like in Greek, but it doesn't work in every language. Evelina claims it doesn't work in Russian, for example.
Okay. So another question from Melody is about the first part of the experimental data from Natalia. What Germanic languages were included? I think it's about her part.
Right, so English, German, obviously, but also since it was an online task, Evelina recruited participants also in Scandinavia, so Germanic languages in Scandinavia, not Finnish, but Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. And I think Dutch was also one of the languages that was spoken in the bilingual group.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, Australia, Canada, USA, UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia.
Mm-hmm. Also, Federico Gallo has a comment and a question. Could it be that these findings only represent an instance of what is known as bilingual cost? For example, that bilinguals are slower to process verbal materials due to cross-linguistic interference. This may lead to a different speed accuracy trade-off. The short-term bilinguals being best but slowest may be due to the fact that they are not expert yet in managing this interference, so they take longer, and thus they can have a different speed accuracy trade-off.
Okay. Thank you for the great question. Of course, I mean, CLI, cross-linguistic influence, should always be considered when we think about bilinguals. So, and it's quite plausible that, I mean, more experienced bilinguals also become more proficient in kind of inhibiting and suppressing the other language, the language that is not currently in use. At the same time, so short-term bilinguals should potentially also, I don't know, so what is often found is that L1 influences L2, but what we find is that there is an effect of kind of recency of experience with the L2 on the L1. What we think the reaction time differences show is actually that they spend more time because they kind of process the sentence more literally, and kind of the semantic processing is better, potentially due to kind of recency of experience with the L2. So they analyze the sentence better, but then they kind of automatize processing in L2, and then the effects on the L1 is also minimized. But yeah, so CLI, when we talk about online measures, may be taken into account there as well. So I don't know how to test this, but potentially one can think of an experiment to this effect.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I have another question here from Barbara Kopke. She says, I have a small question to Natalia. If I rightly understood the methodology, you qualify as online and offline measure the answers and response times given in the same time judgment task. If the task is timed and the participants are told to answer as quickly as possible, if they were, in order to have a nice reaction time, can the answers somehow can this be considered offline? The time pressure would be the same for both measures.
Yeah, so this was, I mean, we had one measure, we had their judgments, but we measured what was the content of the judgment, did they accept the sentence or not, and we also measured reaction times. So both groups were given the same instruction, and so we classified this kind of their response. We took two measures from the same response, actually, so the content of the response and then the speed of the response.
Thank you. Another question from Sibila Leon Guerrero. Very interesting talk. Thank you. I might have missed it, but would you please explain a bit more about the length of bilingual experience? How was it measured, and did recency or intensity matter?
Yeah, so it was a very crude measure, just the number of years that the participant has lived outside of a Greek-speaking country. So participants with 7 and more years, that was the median length of exposure that we had, were included in the kind of long experience group, and participants with less than 7 years were in the short experience group. But yeah, of course, we can also look at this as a continuous measure. We just like took the two groups for the visual presentation purposes.
Thank you. Many comments. Thank you for the talk. And Federico also replies about the question. Thanks. I wouldn't know either from the top of my head, to be honest. Maybe giving them a general speed of verbal processing task beforehand may provide you with a measure to control for in the analysis on your effects of interest.
Yeah, that's a good idea. A lexical decision task, or like some, yeah, typical measure of reaction times.
Any more questions? Maybe some hands raised that I didn't see. I think no, but if not, maybe we can thank again Marit and Natalia for the last talk that they have provided us. And I would thank from my side everybody who has participated. It was great. It was very, very nice discussion during these 2 days, and was pretty smooth. So I would give Andriy the stage, so I'm sure that he would like to say some concluding remarks.
I pretty much wanted to say that I'm personally very happy, and I think on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to congratulate those who are still here in this meeting on a very successful 2-day series of both 6 stellar invited talks and 4 shorter presentations from our Moscow group that we had yesterday. To be honest with you, I was really concerned and worried about doing online conferencing. I'm not a huge fan of online conferencing, and especially I'm even less a fan of organizing one. And I'm really happy that it worked out really well. And I wanted to individually congratulate and say thank you to Mikhail Pokhadai, who did a tremendous job organizing the technical bit of it. So he is our technical king and emperor and magician and wizard. Everything went so smoothly and everything worked, and both at the registration stage with the inquiries and also during the conference. And also I would like to say special thank you to Beatriz Bermudez Margareto. I think I may be wrong, but it's also her first experience running the organizing committee for an online conference.
Yes.
And I'm sure it was a fantastic experience. It definitely worked really well. And that will conclude the event, the CCCP event series for the registered participants.